It happened at Gate 32 of Heathrow Airport. A man in full military uniform stood at the check-in counter, tall, still, and radiating a quiet strength. His medals caught the fluorescent light, drawing the occasional glance. One in particular, a small bronze cross, rested neatly over his heart. The flight attendant barely looked up. Her tone was flat. "You've been moved to economy, sir. We've made adjustments." No explanation. No apology. He didn't flinch. Just nodded once, like he'd faced far worse. Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy looks. Some glanced away, pretending not to see. Others whispered. One young man started filming. No one knew who he was. No one recognized the Victoria Cross on his chest. And in 8 minutes, this quiet moment would shake a nation. The man's name was Thomas Beckett. 62 years old, former Royal Guard, and a decorated veteran of the Afghanistan conflict. He stood with the kind of posture that comes not from pride, but from principle, shoulders back, chin level, eyes steady. His silver hair and lined face told a story few ever heard in full. But one detail stood out above all, the Victoria Cross resting over his chest, quietly gleaming beneath the terminal lights. It had been awarded to him for an act most men wouldn't survive, dragging 6 wounded soldiers from a burning convoy while under direct enemy fire. He didn't talk about it. He didn't wear it for recognition. He wore it for them, the ones who didn't make it back. Today, he was traveling to Edinburgh to attend a private memorial service for a fallen comrade. His flight, arranged through the Veterans Honour Programme, included a business-class seat, a small gesture from the Crown for a man who had given so much. But the airline had overbooked. And someone with a more profitable title, a corporate sponsor, needed his seat. When Thomas stepped forward with his boarding pass, the attendant didn't even make eye contact. Just a tap on the keyboard, a sigh, and a dismissive line. "You'll be in economy, sir. We've made adjustments." She didn't notice the small annotation on the screen. Priority, Royal Guard VC. She didn't recognize the medal. She didn't understand who she was speaking to. No one did. The terminal buzzed as always, families balancing luggage and tantrums, business travelers scrolling emails, flight announcements cutting through the air like static. But somewhere in the midst of that ordinary noise, something shifted. A woman in her 80s stopped walking, hand to her chest. A former soldier leaned into his wife and whispered, "That's Beckett. It has to be." A boy took out his phone, unsure why he felt the urge to start recording. Thomas said nothing. He didn't complain. He didn't resist. He simply accepted the new boarding pass and stepped quietly aside. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal like a quiet summons. Final call for Beckett, Thomas. Thomas stood where he had been all along, near the side wall, out of the way, observing silently. He wasn't confused. He wasn't hesitating. He was simply letting others board first. It was the way he'd always moved through the world, with patience, with respect, with an understanding of order. As the last few passengers filtered through the gate, Thomas approached. But just before he could hand over his boarding pass, the same flight attendant raised a hand, stopping him. Her voice was tighter now. "Sir, I'll need to see your ID again. There's a note here about your attire." He calmly passed her his identification. She read it, squinted at the screen, and then said, too loud for how quiet the gate had become, "You can't wear a ceremonial military uniform in economy. It's airline policy." The words landed like a slap. A hush fell across the boarding line. Someone behind him whispered, "Are you serious?" Another voice, a man in his 30s, said sharply, "That's not just any uniform." The attendant shifted on her feet. Flustered now. "I'm just following protocol." Thomas didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or ask to see a supervisor. He merely removed his cap, cradling it under one arm, and offered the smallest nod. A soldier's answer. A teenager standing by the wall lowered their phone and said softly, "I think that's a Victoria Cross." The words rippled. Someone opened Google. Another person gasped. And suddenly, what had seemed like an ordinary uniform was being studied with reverence. Eyes darted to the bronze cross on his chest. The purple ribbon. The inscription no one there deserved to read. "For valor." An older woman in a wheelchair whispered to her nurse, "My husband died in Kandahar. He always talked about a guard who carried him 3 miles back to base. Said his name was Beckett. Swore he saved half the convoy." The nurse's hand slowly went to her mouth. But none of this reached the airline crew. Not the whispers. Not the swelling recognition. Not the shame beginning to simmer in the silence. The gate closed. The staff returned to their screens, unaware of what had just passed them. And Thomas Beckett, the man who had once stood between chaos and home for so many, walked quietly down the jet bridge and took his seat in the last row of the aircraft. Outside, near a private corridor shielded from public view, 2 men entered the terminal. Both in dark suits. Measured steps. One wore a royal warrant pin on his lapel. And they were not there to board the plane. Mid-flight, the air remained thick, not with turbulence, but with unspoken tension. Whispers drifted up and down the cabin like faint winds through tall grass. A teenager in row 17 showed their phone to their father, the screen displaying a Wikipedia page, Victoria Cross, United Kingdom's highest award for gallantry in the face of the enemy. A middle-aged man in a suit stared silently at Thomas Beckett from across the aisle, slowly removing his earbuds, as if music no longer fit the mood. One flight attendant, now visibly uneasy, approached Thomas with a hesitant smile. She glanced down at the medals, then back at his face. "Would you like something extra, sir? A meal? Tea?" He shook his head politely. "I'm all right. Thank you." Later, a young boy sitting nearby leaned over and offered a wrapped sandwich with both hands. "Mum says you're a hero," he whispered. Thomas smiled, a small, tired smile, and gently declined with a quiet, "You keep it, lad. You'll need it more than I do." When the plane touched down in Edinburgh, passengers began collecting their belongings in the usual hurry, eager to beat the crowd to the terminal. But as the front doors opened, something unusual unfolded. The crew, usually the first to disembark, remained frozen in place. One of them gasped softly. At the base of the boarding stairs, standing with quiet formality, was an airport marshal accompanied by a security officer. They moved with precision, yet their tone was reverent. "Mr. Beckett, sir," the marshal said, his voice measured. "May I ask you to step forward?" Thomas nodded. He assumed it was standard protocol, perhaps another document check, or security formality. But when he reached the doorway, the marshal stepped aside. Standing just beyond the aircraft, his coat buttoned against the wind, was His Majesty King Charles III. No media. No entourage. No flashing cameras. Just the sovereign, waiting, still and steady. "I was informed," the king said gently, "that one of our country's bravest was not treated with the dignity he deserves." A pause. The wind caught the edge of his coat. "It's a mistake I intend to correct, personally." A ripple of sound moved through the aircraft. Someone gasped. A child dropped their toy. One woman put her hand to her mouth and began to cry. Thomas instinctively stood at attention, preparing to salute, but the king stepped forward, raised his hand, and saluted him first. No anger. No spectacle. Just a moment of honor, restored with quiet grace. By the time Thomas Beckett and King Charles III turned and walked side by side across the tarmac, the world had already begun to watch. Inside the plane, at least 3 passengers had uploaded footage of the moment: the salute, the gasp from the crowd, the monarch waiting in the wind. One tweet spread faster than the rest. An airline just downgraded a Victoria Cross recipient. King Charles met him on the runway. This is how a nation apologizes. By nightfall, it had over 12 million views. Hashtags surged to the top of the global feed. #salute the guard. #truevalor. #BeckettVC. Clips flooded TikTok, stitched together with reactions from stunned veterans and teary-eyed teenagers. Reddit threads dissected every moment: the way Thomas held his cap, the expression on the king's face, the pause before the salute. Major news outlets picked up the story. Headlines rolled across screens like breaking waves. Hero downgraded, nation responds. King Charles delivers silent lesson in honor. Piers Morgan called it a disgraceful oversight, followed by one of the most powerful acts of humility ever broadcast without a microphone. A veterans advocacy group launched a petition for mandatory airline training on recognizing military decorations, gathering over 300,000 signatures in a single day. But the story didn't stay in the headlines. It went deeper. In classrooms across the UK, teachers played the clip during morning assemblies. In one school in Manchester, a Year 7 class paused for a minute of silence, not for the fallen, but for the living reminder of what courage and grace look like. A group of students wrote handwritten letters addressed simply to Mr. Beckett, VC, thanking him for his strength, his kindness, his patience. One teenager posted a selfie with red-rimmed eyes, writing, "I never cared about medals or uniforms. But that salute made me cry. That's what strength looks like. Not yelling. Not power. Just respect." The airline released a formal apology. Their CEO made a public statement. But it wasn't enough to contain the fallout. Their stock dipped 2% overnight. Thousands of loyal members cancelled their premium memberships. Their social media channels were flooded with comments. "Do you know what the Victoria Cross is now? Train your staff. Learn your history. Never again." And through it all, Thomas Beckett said nothing. He gave no interviews. Ignored all media requests. His only public comment appeared in a quiet, unassuming corner of a respected military journal, a scanned, handwritten letter. Dignity is not something you demand. It's something you maintain, especially when others forget it. Within 24 hours, the airline CEO issued a public statement. He called it a regrettable failure of protocol, but acknowledged that protocol wasn't the real issue, it was a failure of recognition. A failure of respect. The statement went viral, but what caught more attention was what didn't happen. The gate attendant was not fired. That decision came from Thomas Beckett himself. He had been contacted quietly, offered a chance to file a formal complaint. Instead, he asked that the young woman not be punished, only educated. And so, the airline announced the launch of a new initiative in his name. The Silent Veiler Program, a training curriculum for all staff, teaching the history and significance of military honors, with a focus on humility, discretion, and human dignity. The backlash from the public remained intense, but it shifted tone, from outrage to purpose. Airline customers began asking more questions about the people they flew beside. Veterans noticed a change, priority seating codes updated, medals no longer mislabeled as decorative pins. A quiet reverence returned to airport spaces where uniforms had once been overlooked. Behind the scenes, Parliament fast-tracked a bipartisan bill. It required all national honours like the Victoria Cross, George Cross, and Distinguished Service Order to be automatically flagged in government-partnered travel systems, ensuring this kind of oversight would never happen again. And Thomas? He made no speeches. Gave no interviews. He flew to the memorial service in Edinburgh. Sat in the back row. Removed his cap during the hymn. Then quietly slipped away before the reception. No one saw him leave. But a week later, at a veterans' charity event in London, something unexpected happened. Standing beside him at the podium, shoulders tight, face pale, was the same gate attendant. She had asked to attend. She had written a letter of apology, folded neatly in her hands. When she began to read it aloud, her voice trembled. But Thomas stopped her mid-sentence. He looked her in the eyes, and with the same calm steadiness he had shown at the gate, he said, "You made a mistake. You didn't dishonor me. You reminded the country what honor looks like." Her eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak. And for the rest of the evening, she said nothing at all. She simply stood beside him, not as a disgraced employee, but as a reminder that growth is possible when dignity leads the way. Weeks passed. The headlines quieted. The hashtags slowed. But something had shifted, not just online, but in the air itself. Across airports in the UK, a quiet change took root. Not mandated. Not branded. Just a small addition to certain flight announcements. If you're seated near a veteran wearing the Victoria Cross, please take a moment to recognize their service. They represent the best of us. No fanfare. No applause. Just a nod, earned, not requested. As for Thomas Beckett, he returned to his life in Devon. A modest cottage near the coast. He tended his roses, walked with his dog, drank tea at the same cafe every Thursday. He never gave another public statement, never posted, never replied to the flood of letters that poured in, though many were found carefully folded in a wooden box beside his fireplace. When invited, he visited local schools. Not as a hero, but as a guest. He'd speak softly to young cadets, show them how to stand tall. Sometimes, he'd straighten a shoulder, adjust a chin. But mostly, he listened. And across a country still grappling with noise, division, and spectacle, he reminded people what quiet strength looks like. Because what Thomas Becket gave wasn't just a moment. He gave a mirror, to an institution, to a generation, to a nation. He showed that respect isn't loud. It doesn't shout or shove. It doesn't need to announce itself to be real. It stands calm when overlooked. It walks forward when unseen. And when met with cruelty or indifference, it does not flinch. Because true strength doesn't always fight back. Sometimes, it just wears silence like a medal. And now, it's your turn. If you had seen a man like that, a man in uniform, holding a boarding pass and being dismissed, would you have spoken up? Or would you have looked away?